Hello, everybody. Eric Grenier here, and welcome to the 13th episode of the Writ podcast, the first post-election edition of the podcast. The results are in, and they look pretty familiar, but that doesn't mean this election won't have significant consequences for the future of Canadian politics. So to talk about that, I'm joined again by the CBC's Aaron Wherry. Hey, Aaron.
Hey, Eric.
You were in Montreal on election night, covering the Liberals. What was the mood like before the results came in, and then after they came in?
I think before there was a mix of optimism and apprehension. I don't know that anyone was really quite positive how things were going to go and how wide the spread would be between them and the Conservatives. I think there was a sense, like some of the best guesses I heard that kind of going into election night were that the Liberals might finish somewhere in the 140s, which would obviously be down from 2019 and could be potentially really close with the Conservatives. And, you and others had pointed out that the Conservatives still had a, 25 to 30% chance of finishing with the most seats. So I think there was a fair bit there was optimism. I think there was a sense that they were going to end up with the most seats, but it wasn't a calm, oh, this one's in the bag, we're good. And then afterwards, I think, because of the apprehension going in, I think it was a lot of relief. I think it was just sort of like, whew, we made it through that. Okay. I think they were happy about the victory. I think they were happy at how relatively decisive it was. Maybe even a bit defensive about the idea that it wasn't as big as it should have been. But I think overwhelmingly, it was just a sort of like, okay, we got through this. We got it done. We pulled it out of our hat once again.
It's a little bit of a near-death experience, maybe, that there is the realization that they actually could have lost this. And hey, yes. Look, we didn't. We actually, got another mandate that's a lot like the last one. And we saw that, like, some of the takes very soon after were, that this was a bad result for the Liberals because they didn't get their majority government. But as we're seeing, reporting about Otoole having some internal issues, things are going to change. So do you think this will be remembered, not, this week or next week, but in the future, as just a win or as something else?
I think that as time goes on, it's very possible that this result looks better than it maybe did on election night. I think the impulse on election night was to say Trudeau didn't get his majority. He's weak. He's weaker than we thought going into this campaign. He comes out of this a sort of diminished politician, and this could foretell bad things ahead for the Liberals. And I think as time goes on, you start to pick apart the results a bit, and you go, well, they picked up seats in the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area. They won some seats. They won some seats in British Columbia that you maybe wouldn't have predicted they would win. And they, to my surprise, really, like, they have 2 seats in Alberta again. I don't know if I ever would have imagined the Trudeau Liberals having 2 seats in Alberta again. And when you look across the aisle, you go, well, Aaron Otoole is going to have to fight for his job. Jagmeet Singh and the NDP don't seem to have made any significant gains. And so there are going to be questions about their campaign. The Greens obviously are diminished, and the Bloc Québécois is still there, but it doesn't feel like this was a sort of ringing endorsement of their campaign. I mean, the conventional wisdom starts to be that a lot of that result turned on, a question from the moderator in the English language debate, and so you start to kind of look around and you go, well, a win, as I and others have said, a win is a win, and there's not going to be a real appetite, I don't think, for an election in the foreseeable future, especially because the Conservatives and the NDP just spent the last 5 weeks saying how unnecessary this election was. So, maybe Trudeau comes out of this with an okay hand to play, actually. And as we saw yesterday too, Doug Ford comes out and in his first post-election comment says, yeah, we want to make a deal on childcare. And so I don't know that Ford comes out and says that if the result is weaker for the Liberals. And so, Trudeau gets to come in now and make some deals on childcare, advance things on that and implement some policy, presumably with, NDP or Bloc cooperation, and stick around for at least 2 more years and get some stuff done. When you look at all the alternatives, maybe it obviously would have been better for them if they had had a majority, but I don't know that winning 158 seats should be treated as a real setback for them.
But you mentioned how this could work in Parliament, and that's a question I have, because I think the cynical kind of reaction and the knee-jerk reaction that I think even I had was, I guess we're going to be doing this again very soon. But then I was thinking about it. Well, actually, I'm not so sure about that, because the Liberals, I think, are going to be extremely reticent to risk another early election call. So that's almost off the table for them. And now the opposition parties would, as you said, they just campaigned on not having an election. Would they want to risk the blowback that seems like it was a real thing in this campaign of calling or forcing an election? So it's a little bit of a standoff. I'm not sure if either of them are. It's not a question of who's going to blink first. It's whether any of them have the, want to be a gambler and take a shot on another early call. So maybe this Parliament actually survives kind of long.
Yeah, the usual math, right, is that, a minority parliament's only going to last 2 years. I would bet the over on this one, because I just think that there just isn't the lingering feeling from this election is going to be, don't call another election, and for all sides. And that can change if there's a huge scandal or a huge problem or an economic crisis or something that kind of really damages the Liberals. Then the opposition parties might throw caution to the wind and make a move. But in the meantime, assuming that kind of things are as they are right now, there's not I don't know how much of an appetite the public's even going to have for sort of saber rattling and threats of election. I think it's possible the public could end up feeling pretty negatively towards a party that seems to be needlessly getting in the way of things. I mean, if the message of this election was sort of like, actually, we kind of like the way things were, so just go back to work. I think if I was another party, barring a major change in public opinion that's noticeable in the polls, I think I'd be pretty loath to try to say, well, actually, how about we have another election?
Does this then open up some opportunity for Trudeau to implement some last kind of things as like a legacy item? Because when you think about his father accomplished kind of a lot in the first in the 80s in his last term, does that give him time for that to then try to get these things done and then step aside, or go for another election? I'm not sure anymore. I'm wavering a little bit on the idea that Trudeau's days are numbered.
Yeah, I think that also we can also sort of overplay that idea. Like I've never really gotten the sense that the Trudeau government or that Trudeau himself was kind of built for the long haul. My former colleague Paul Wells wrote that book about Stephen Harper entitled, The Longer I'm Prime Minister. And the thinking there was that Stephen Harper saw value in longevity. The longer he stayed as Prime Minister, the more things he could do and the more he could get people used to there being a conservative government in power. Justin Trudeau's personality is so different, and the way he does politics is so different, and he's so front and center, and he's trying to be so active on so many fronts that I don't think that lends itself to governing for a decade or 15 years or something like that. So I've kind of always wondered at what point Trudeau would walk away. And having won now 3 elections, you can look at it and say, you've won 3 elections, but your popular vote support has never gotten back to where it was in 2015. How risky would it be to go through a 4th election? Do you want to risk defeat? And maybe, on the other hand, maybe it would be smart to start setting up some succession planning. But at the same time, let's not rule that out, and let's not rule out the possibility that he goes into a 4th election, because I think the other thing that kind of got overstated as this campaign wore on were sort of his own personal negatives. His personal image, yes, if you look at advocacy data, for instance, His negatives still outstrip his positives, but he still looks. His personal ratings are still better than O'Toole's. They haven't crashed. He's I think better off than he was at the end of the 2019 campaign, and he was still at the end of this campaign, according to both Nanos and Abacus, the preferred prime minister. So I think it's possible he could still be thinking about a fourth election, but I think he also could use this time to pick 3 or 4 things and say, we are absolutely going to drive these things forward: childcare, affordable housing, climate change, reconciliation. Pick whichever 4 you want. Although I think reconciliation, climate, and childcare would be near the top of his list. Do those things and then hand it off, and then say, okay, let's, it's the Liberal Party would probably benefit from a fresh face, so let's hand it off. But one way or either way, if he wants to run again or not, I think he has a chance now, in sort of with the pandemic crisis sort of hopefully receding eventually, to make some big moves on things like climate and childcare that, go on his permanent record, that look really good 20, 30, 40 years from now.
If you think about, I know there's always the parallels with his father, but a lot of people in the 70s were looking at the Trudeau years and saying, no, actually not that much happened here. But it's what happened in those last few years that in a way cemented his kind of legacy in the pantheon of prime ministers.
Totally. Yeah. Like, I'll just to throw one last thing on there. Yeah. If you read what was written about Pierre Trudeau at the end of, like, when he had just lost to Joe Clark, the feeling was really disappointment that he hadn't amounted to much. And so that last term ended up really defining Pierre Trudeau's legacy.
I don't want to make a prediction or anything like this on the future for Erin O'Toole, because I mean, it does seem like he will have some issues. He might be able to hold on. And like it was with Andrew Scheer, it could drag on for a while before the answers get, clear in terms of what's going to be the future for Erin O'Toole. But for Conservatives, do you think that they will look at what this election was, and you hear it from a lot of Conservative commentators that when they try to run like Liberals, they don't win. It's when they win. It's when they run like Conservatives, that's when they win. I think you can question that. You look at the wins that Stephen Harper had. There was a tired Liberal government, pretty not good Liberal leaders, a 2011 result that was an anomalous, bizarre result. But do you think that Conservatives will take the wrong lesson or the right lesson from this? That going to the center doesn't work, or, I'm not sure what they're going to do. And, it's one thing to be someone looking from the outside in, and it's another thing to be a Conservative member who might have voted for Erin O'Toole because you thought he was going to bring you back to Conservative principles, and in the end ran a bit more like Peter MacKay.
Right. I think Erin O'Toole could fairly say, look, you can't judge just from this election and say that moderating our views on a few things isn't enough. I don't know if that you can quite make that. I don't think there's enough to make that conclusion. It's possible that, the same platform or the same kind of moderate approach 2 years or 4 years from now could work. Because I do think that to win an election in this country, you do have to have a serious climate plan. And you do have to take seriously issues like inequality and reconciliation. You can't, people will be a little reluctant to vote for you if you don't seem to have something to say about those issues, if you aren't credible on those issues. I think the problem for O'Toole is that he's the base of the party is probably not in love with the things he did on climate, for instance. And as you said, like, he ran as one thing during the leadership race, and then he ran as another during the general election. And I think you saw that catch up with him in this campaign, because the on gun control, for instance, the general electorate kind of figured out, like, wait a second, who, like, what are you exactly? Like, are you what you say you are now? Are you, do you actually have really hard conservative beliefs that you're trying to bury right now? And I think that hurt him in the general. And I think now there could be, amongst people who voted for O'Toole, in the Conservative leadership race a bit of buyer's remorse because he didn't turn out to be what they thought they were going to get. And winning elections can cover up for a lot of those things. If he wins, then people who wish he was more conservative can say, well, at least he's in power. And then, so since he didn't win, I think he is vulnerable. But I guess, I don't know. To me, it seems like if he's going to be in trouble, it's going to be because someone in the party is going to kind of make a push to push him out. Like I don't. It feels like if the Conservative Party is going to go in a different direction, someone has to kind of galvanize that feeling. But yeah, I think it is very possible that the lesson the Conservative Party takes away from this is that they have to be actually more ideologically and stridently conservative. And I think that could end up backfiring on them. If you look at the Liberals in opposition, they kind of had to hit rock bottom before they realized what they had to do to get back into power. And these federal Conservatives haven't actually hit rock bottom, really, unless you think rock bottom is where they're at right now. And so they're still in a bit of a weird place of having to try to kind of figure out which, trying to think like in little adjustments, that maybe they just need to make little adjustments to win. And it'll be interesting to see kind of how that plays out psychologically right now.
Yeah, because when I think about, whether, let's say, Peter MacKay, how he would have done in this campaign, even if he had ran the exact same campaign and had said the same exact things, I feel like he would have been seen to have been given a mandate from the membership to run this kind of campaign. And so it would have seemed more legitimate. It would have seemed more authentic. And I think that was one of the issues here, is that for the Conservatives, they know that this was not what Aaron Otoole was elected on, and that the majority of his caucus probably does not support a lot of these policies. So I feel like that was maybe a bigger issue. Maybe in another election, if people give him a stamp of approval, then he has that mandate to continue this path. But I feel that might have been really their biggest problem, that not necessarily the policies, but whether people bought it, I think.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. Like, to me, there was just that feeling of like I understand. I think there was a reaction in sort of political elite journalist circles, which was sort of, oh, well, he's pivoting, but politicians have to do this. You have to run to the right to win the party, and then you run to the center to win the general election. And I think the journalistic political elite kind of level conversation took for granted that people would be okay with that. And maybe Otoole would have been fine. Maybe he would have gotten through this election, but eventually it catches up to you, right? Like eventually the Liberals start digging up what you said when you were running for leader. Eventually something in your platform that you promised when you were running for leader catches up to you in with gun control. And on something like climate change, I think as much as the Conservatives put forward a credible plan this time, they were still less ambitious than the Liberals. And I think there was still a sort of feeling of like, can you trust the Conservatives to actually pursue this? Like, they've still got people in caucus who don't seem super keen on this stuff. Are you sure they would actually go through with this? And I think that, maybe if he runs again in 2 or 4 years or whatever, and he is still championing the same messages, and he's maybe brought other voices into the party to kind of advance that message, then maybe he seems a bit more credible on those things.
Let's move on to the NDP. So, they're up a little bit. Their popular vote went up by a couple points. And we'll see once all the votes are counted, they maybe have gained a net gain of 1. But what can the NDP take from this? Because going into this campaign, we were talking a lot about the NDP and its potential. But a gain of 1 seat might be better than losing. Aaron Otoole seems to have lost 2 seats, and that's worse. But does the NDP say, well, Singh is still getting, comfortable in the role, and people are going to eventually see him as the best prime minister because they like him already. And in 2-4 years, we'll get that big breakthrough. I'm curious what the NDP takes from this, because it clearly did not meet their expectations, but it wasn't a bad enough result that a lot of them might ask themselves questions. I don't know.
Yeah, to me, they're the fascinating, like, they've been on such a psychological roller coaster over the last 6 years. Like, they come out of 2015 with 44 seats. but they lost their shot at power. They've lost a bunch of seats. Tom Mulcair is being criticized for being outflanked to the left, and he's maybe not everyone's favorite New Democrat, so they dump him. They bring in Jagmeet Singh, who seems like kind of a Trudeau-esque figure, but then he has a real, like, people kind of forget about this now, he has a really tough start to his leadership, fundraising-wise, polling-wise, and going into the 2019 election, people are like, well, are they going to be able to remain at official party status? Are the Greens going to get ahead of them? And he then has a couple, he sort of ends the 2019 campaign on a high note. The party does better than you might have thought it was going to do, but it still loses 19 seats. And Singh still kind of celebrates like it's a victory. They come into this election and they seem to have higher hopes. Maybe they're going to win 40 seats. And they end up kind of boosting their popular vote, but flatlining. But it doesn't feel like there is a huge rush. It seems like there is some discontent, but I don't know how in danger Jagmeet Singh is, because it feels to me like the party is kind of happy with where it is ideologically and ambition-wise. And so it's less upset about the result. I don't know whether it would make sense really to dump Jagmeet Singh off after this election. I don't think they should be having a victory parade by any stretch of the imagination. And I think there are serious questions to be asked about the campaign they ran. But once you've sort of got, like, you're kind of invested now in this guy, maybe it's worth facing another election and seeing if you can build something here, like you did with Layton. Because switching leaders again, I don't know whether that's necessarily going to get you any further ahead.
Yeah. I think you can say that he wasn't necessarily why they didn't break through. You could look to the platform, you could look to, some of the things that they were proposing, and whether they were seen as credible policies that could actually be implemented. But I'm not sure if you look at this campaign and see, well, the problem was Singh. So, I can see where you wouldn't have a move to remove him. Maybe just more of an exercise in what does the party have to propose and how to build its platform. But it's an interesting, because what you just said about the party being comfortably in its ideological, skin, you have a result that is almost identical to the last one, but the NDP feels better about who they are representing and how they're presenting themselves. So they're comfortable with it. And you have the Conservatives who have an identical result to the last time, but they don't feel very comfortable about where they have positioned themselves. And that is more of a problem, because you're right, with Tom Mulcair in 2015, by any stretch, any historical perspective of the performance of the NDP, 16 seats in Quebec, nearly 20% of the vote, it was a good result, but it left a bad taste in a lot of New Democrats' mouth.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like, I remember I had a conversation with Rebecca Blakey, who was the party president, and, Bill Blakey's daughter, and, steeped in the history of that party. And I think it was at that convention where they dumped Mulcair. And I was asking her about the NDP and the kind of unique nature of that party. And she said, the one thing I remember she said to me was, the NDP wants to win, but it wants that win to be about something. And I think I think it's too easy to say that, only the NDP cares about ideology and its principles. The Liberals have principles and ideology too, and so do the Conservatives. But the NDP they want to make sure they're ideologically right, and then they want to win. Whereas the Conservatives and the Liberals, probably because they've been in power before, are a bit more open to the idea that they have to move around a bit. And they have to, they're going to have to make compromises along the way to get to power. And so I think the NDP can sort of stay in that mode. But I think if there was one thing they need to clean up, it's the credibility gap. They got kind of knocked around in the climate policy world because they came out with a big goal and they made all sorts of kind of commitments in the platform, but they never explained it. They never showed exactly how they were going to get there. They never accounted for how they would hit that climate target. And Singh, in a lot of his press conferences, would just sort of glide over the details of things like, "Oh, we're going to eliminate for-profit long-term care." Okay, that's an interesting idea. How exactly would you do that? How long would that take? How do you think the provinces are going to react to that? Like, you have to put some substance there, and you have to show that you have a grasp of how difficult some of these things are and what it would take. And even though I don't think, look, voters don't look at platforms and then read all sorts of deep policy analysis, or at least, the vast majority of voters don't. But I think in hearing the media commentary, in listening to politicians, they can sense when something's not quite credible, or that the promises being made are kind of unrealistic. And I think that's where Singh runs into trouble. I also wonder whether painting Trudeau as this, they ran quite negative on Trudeau, and I wonder at some point whether that wasn't necessarily the right tone for what they wanted to, for the voters they needed to appeal to.
Yeah, because I think that was a bit of an issue, because a lot of the people that the NEP would be targeting for growth are already with the Liberals. And while they might be disappointed with Trudeau, they don't think he's a complete fraud.
Right.
So I think that, that is a little bit of a tough message. It certainly, for the progressives who back the NDP and, are very upset about what the Liberals have done on, electoral reform, or, falling short on reconciliation, that kind of thing. I'm sure it was music to their ears, but it's that mushy middle that they had to go after. The People's Party, 5% of the vote, didn't really meet some of its polls. I know there's lots of questions about the enduring, lasting nature of the PPC, whether it's a blip or not. But here's my question instead. Does Maxime Bernier, and can Maxime Bernier, know how to keep a lid on this? Does he have control over the movement that he has unleashed? Because you saw, for example, when Donald Trump gave a speech sometime after he had lost the election, and he was telling his people that they should get vaccinated, he got booed. Right. I'm wondering if Maxime Bernier fully understands what the People's Party represents, and whether he is actually the leader of it, or just the person who happened to lead the party that was tapping into what that group of people was thinking.
That's an interesting question. So you would look back on his career as a minister and say he was not the most organized man in the world. And that is carrying over here. And so maybe he doesn't have an iron grip on whatever is going on here. And it doesn't, I don't know how much infrastructure this party really has. It seems like more of a movement than a political party. But it does need a figurehead. It does need somebody who's has some political talent and is willing to stand up there and say things and represent those grievances. So I don't know that it necessarily could just go away. Like I don't know that he's sort of, perfectly replaceable, and they could bring somebody else in and it would just keep going. I think he probably is bringing something to it, but I don't know that he has a full handle. It's hard to control a movement, and you never quite know where it's going to go. And the question is where, once the pandemic starts to recede, what does it latch onto next? And I think people who guess that it will disappear after the pandemic goes away, I think that is overly presumptive, I guess, because I think populist movements can latch onto any number of issues, and there could be something else that comes up. And an anti-system, anti-establishment feeling could carry on in all sorts of different ways. So I guess that would be sort of my way of saying that I don't think he has a lid on it necessarily. I don't think he, can dictate where this goes next. But I do think he has a fair bit of power to sort of direct where it goes next, and to be that focal point for, whatever the angst is that's out there.
I wonder if I wasn't watching a lot of his, campaign things. I wonder if he brought up supply management.
I think they've moved past supply management, but they'll find there's always been populist movements. They always can flare up. They flare up at different times, and they're over sort of different issues. And whether it's immigration next, or climate policy, or economic change, or it could be any number of things. And I think we also have to be a bit humbled here by the fact that, in 2019, a lot of us, including me, were like, well, that's that. The People's Party was a fun little ride, but it's over now. And here we are with them at 5% and polling at double what the Greens got.
The Bloc Québécois, their campaign, it was just kind of a listless campaign that they seem to be dropping down to their base of support. And they were rejuvenated by that English language debate question. It made the Bloc relevant for the last 2 weeks because it felt for a lot of Francophone Quebecers that they were being under attack, and the Bloc is the party that can defend them, I guess. But rather than talk about the Bloc's campaign itself, you wrote about the potential for future minority governments. And the Bloc Québécois, the fact that it's now seems to be back, it has 2 consecutive elections where it's a force, it's taking nearly half the seats off the table in Quebec. Minority governments seem to be much more likely than majority governments now. So you wrote about this and just how is this going to change things? Do the parties need to start rethinking about what it is to make Parliament work?
Yeah, I mean, well, I guess it remains to be seen whether they actually will change, but I do think they need to change, because if this is the norm, if we're probably going to have minority parliaments for the foreseeable future, or they're going to happen more often than not, I don't think we can, I don't know that the electorate and that the political system can really handle the idea that we're going to have elections every 2 years. The default position can't be, well, a minority only lasts 2 years, so that's kind of your baseline expectation.
It'll be nice for a year, and then we'll fall on each other for the last 6 months.
Yeah, and I don't think Parliament can handle kind of constant saber rattling and brinksmanship and threats of election. And I just don't think the system can handle it. I think it'll undermine public faith in Parliament, and I think ultimately it will lead to less effective government. And so I don't know that parties need to, I don't know if we're ever going to get to a point where coalitions are the norm, where governments are formed by two or more parties and they share spots in cabinet. But it does feel like on a kind of day-to-day basis, the parties need to get much better at figuring out, as much as they want to yell at each other, they have to figure out how to make Parliament function and get things moving. They have to figure out how to live with each other, essentially. And then on a larger level, I wonder if governments and parties need to move towards more formal agreements on legislation and what's going to happen and how things are going to work. Because right now, we kind of function on a week-to-week, bill-to-bill basis. Government puts forward a bill, and then it sees who's going to agree to it and whether it needs to make any compromises. And that, that's a pretty that's a pretty kind of acrimonious, constant back and forth way of doing things. And I don't know that necessarily they need to sign what they call confidence and supply agreements that kind of govern 2 or 4 years of Parliament, but there seems to be kind of an opening here for, in this context, for instance, the Liberals and the NDP to sit down and say, all right, can we agree on, 6 things we're going to do over the next 2 years? And then we'll revisit, and then we'll make sure we get those things done. And we'll also agree on kind of how Parliament's going to go, or what we'll do together to make sure things keep functioning. Some kind of working arrangement instead of kind of this ad hoc chaos and this game of chicken that we have at the moment.
Is the solution to adopt the electoral system of Baden-Württemberg?
Well, I know that you love that. I mean, obviously that region of Germany is very well governed and is sort of a beacon to Democrats across the world.
I assume so.
But I don't think, more seriously, I don't think electoral reform is in the cards. I know people are going to say proportional representation, this is its moment, but that 2018 British Columbia referendum on proportional representation where it lost, I think that really took the legs out from underneath the reform movement. I just don't know how you can adopt it federally if you already have one province on the record as saying it doesn't want it provincially. And there's just no party consensus. If the federal Conservative Party came out tomorrow, though, and said, hey, you know what, we've won the popular vote, as problematic a metric as that might be, in the last 2 elections. So, hey, we think proportional representation would be a good idea. If that happened, then maybe you'd have some political consensus and you could start to build something and move forward. But they're not going to do that. And short of political consensus, I think the system is going to stay. I think first past the post is going to stay in place. I actually think there are a lot of reasons to keep it in place, but that just means that you have to fix the way kind of the parties work within that system to ensure that, you know, it's not complete madness.
Hopefully the madness for the next couple of years will die down a little bit. You know, maybe we won't have an election as soon as we all think, but maybe we will. I don't know. We'll have to wait and see.
Well, I can understand why you might be biased in favor of elections. And
we should be voting every day.
I will be watching you for your agitating for Parliament to fall. But there will be other elections, Eric. They just will happen provincially. And it would be nice if maybe the federal Parliament took a break from having elections for a little while.
All right. That sounds fine. All right. Well, thanks so much, Aaron. I really appreciate you taking some time to speak to me today.
Always a pleasure, Eric.
Hey, I'm Brett Chang.
And I'm Jay Rosenthal.
And we're here to tell you about Canada's top
and only
daily business news podcast.
It's called The Peak Daily, and every morning we get you up to speed on the need-to-know Canadian and global business stories.
And we do it without all the jargon that can make business news a little
dull?
Dull, exactly.
And did you mention we do it all in just 7 minutes?
6 minutes if we fast forward through all of your dad jokes.
Well, I prefer to call them rad jokes, Brett.
See what I mean? Come for the daily business news, stay for the dad jokes. Join us and thousands of Peak Pals every morning to start your day smarter. Find the Peak Daily wherever you listen to your podcasts.
All right, time for questions and answers. I got this one from Balch on Twitter. There seems to be a narrative that PPC was a spoiler for the Conservatives. Is there any data to back that up? I think this is a big question that we're going to need to see some post-election polling data to have a much better grasp of it. And it is the kind of question that I want to delve into in much more detail in a future article on the Writ.ca. But I think that we can definitely say there are some ridings where the PPC vote did take away Conservative votes, and enough of them to cost the Conservatives the seat. David Coletto, the CEO of Abacus Data, he tweeted that 28% of the PPC vote was from the Conservatives. A big chunk of it was people who voted for the PPC back in 2019, and about a tenth of the PPC vote were new voters, which was higher than the Conservatives and the Liberals, but less than the NDP, which makes sense. The NDP has younger voters. But if we use that 28% as our guiding post, we can identify a few ridings where at least that many votes was enough to make the difference. Again, I'd like to do a much more in-depth review of this. And this is before all the mail ballots have been counted, so some of these numbers might change. But let's look at 4 examples I could find. So there's Kitchener South Hespeler. The Liberals won this by about 670 votes, but there were 3,300 People's Party votes. 28% of 3,300 is just over 900 votes. So if the PPC did take 900 votes away from the Conservatives in Kitchener South Hespeler, that is enough that they would have won that seat. It's the same thing in Kitchener-Conestoga. The margin there is under 200 votes, and the PPC had 3,600 votes. And 28% of 3,600 votes is just over 1,000. So that's a very obvious example of the PPC taking many more votes than the Conservatives needed to win. It's interesting to me that both of these Kitchener seats seem to have been impacted by the PPC. 2 other ones I could find was Sault Ste. Marie. Again, 250 vote margin, about 1,900 votes for the PPC, and even if you have that low mark, which that Abacus number seems to me low, because some pollsters seem to suggest that maybe more of the PPC vote came from the Conservatives, but if it's 28%, you're still talking about over 500 votes in Sault Ste. Marie, many more than the margin between the Liberals and the Conservatives. And then finally, Trois-Rivières, which at the last count that I saw, the gap was only 93 votes. There was 1,100 for the PPC, so that's about 300 at least that would have come from the Conservatives. So there are certainly some ridings that the Conservatives lost because of the PPC. And in some of these, it would be more, right? It's not going to be 28% in every single riding. In some areas, more Conservatives would have went over to the PPC. In some areas, fewer would have. But I think it's undeniable that the PPC cost the Conservative seats. What I don't know is if they cost them enough to have a consequential outcome on the election. You can't just take the PPC vote, add it to the Conservative vote, and say that was a vote split. Just in the same way that you can't do that with NDP or Green votes when you're looking at the Liberals. Not all of those votes belong to the bigger parties. And for a lot of those people, they would go elsewhere or they would stay home rather than vote for either the Liberals or the Conservatives. But this is something that I think we're going to have to take a deeper look at, because it was definitely a big story in this campaign. David Cahy asks, what should we make of the Green win in Kitchener Centre? Any feel for whether they'll be able to hold on to that seat? So Kitchener Centre is, in a way, the seat that makes the Green election look not so bad. Because if it wasn't for Kitchener Centre, the Greens would be reduced just to Elizabeth May again. Unless Paul Manley ends up winning Nanaimo Ladysmith once the mail ballots are counted. But Kitchener Centre was a little bit of an asterisk of a seat, because the Liberals, of course, had Raj Saini, who was their candidate. He suspended his campaign pretty early on, but after the nomination deadline. And a lot of people didn't vote for the Liberals because of that. A lot of people probably already voted for the Liberals, and so their vote was locked in by mail. Or they didn't know the story and cast their ballot for the Liberals anyway. The result in that seat, at least again, based on the preliminary results, Mike Morris of the Greens had 35%, so his vote went up 9 points from the last election. The Conservatives were at 24%, that was no different. The NDP was at 17%, that was a gain of 6. The Liberals were at 16%. They still got 16% of the vote, so the Liberal vote dropped by 21 percentage points. That's not going to happen in a regular election. So for the Greens to hold on to Kitchener Centre, Mike Morris needs to hold on to his 35%. 35% is not a very big number to win a seat. It means that you're going to be fighting to hold a seat. So he needs to grow that, or at least not lose a lot. Because in a normal election, if the Liberals have a normal candidate, the Liberals are probably going to get 35% of the vote. So I don't think the Greens should take this as a sign that Kitchener Centre is part of a Green wave. It was a weird riding because of the suspension of the Liberal candidate campaign. I think that for the Greens, this is an opportunity. Mike Morris is going to have all the advantages of being an incumbent, and he can set down some roots that can pay off in the future. Greens have tended to be difficult to defeat once they're incumbents. So it's an opportunity, but they can't take this one for granted. I think a lot of the votes that went to the Greens in this campaign will go back to the Liberals in a normal election. The question is how many. I got this question from two different people on Twitter, Colin at Starcords and Connor at Connor D. Peters. What is the most surprising seat change to you? What do you see as some of the biggest upsets? There are mail ballots to still count. Maybe not enough to make a difference, but if you're watching the live stream that I did on Monday night, which, by the way, I had a lot of fun doing it, and I hope those of you that tuned in enjoyed it. I think I'll do it again in future elections, provincial elections, that kind of thing. But if you watch that, the one that we talked about a lot was Coast of Bays, Central Notre Dame in Newfoundland and Labrador. This was a riding that the Conservatives are leading. Not a huge lead. They have a lead of 500 or 600 votes, the last I saw. But that was a surprise. No one saw that coming. A lot of the other shifts that we saw, seat changes here or there, not really shocking. They're ridings that we all thought were ones to watch. Maybe some of the surprise was the two Richmond-Steveston ridings. The Liberals won in British Columbia and Markham-Unionville in Toronto. These are ridings with large Chinese-Canadian communities, and they seem to have withstood the swing to the Liberals over the last few elections in the suburban areas, but in this campaign they didn't. They went over to the Liberals pretty big, so I think that's an interesting one. And the kind of thing that you can't pick up in a regional swing model, for example. But anyway, Coast of Bays, Central Notre Dame in Newfoundland and Labrador, to me was the biggest surprise. Scott Sims has been the MP for that area, and the boundaries have changed quite significantly, but he has been the MP for that area since 2004, which means he survived the cull in 2011 and the minority years of in 2006, 2008. And the last time part of this riding was blue was when it voted for the PCs back in 1997. Sims won this riding by 13 points in 2019. He won it by 57 points in 2015, and he lost it. It's a bit of a shock. The Conservatives haven't had a lot of luck in Newfoundland and Labrador for a long time. The last time they won a seat in the province was back in 2011 when they won in Labrador, so not on Newfoundland itself. So that was a big surprise, and I'm not really sure why. Not really sure why, but it was a bit of a shock, and I guess that's why it was a bit of a shock. All right, since the results of the 2021 election were so similar to those of the 2019 vote, I wanted to take a look at the last time we saw two elections with nearly identical outcomes. So on this week's installment of the Every Election Project, let's delve into the federal election held on November 8th, 1965. Lester Pearson's Liberals had come to power in 1963 after defeating John Diefenbaker's Progressive Conservatives, who had been reduced to a minority government the year before. Pearson's first few years of navigating his own minority government weren't very easy, and they were made more difficult by some scandals within his cabinet and some heightened tensions with the provinces. His opponent across the aisle was still Diefenbaker, who was fighting off calls from within his own party to step down from the leadership. The Liberals thought that these internal divisions made the PCs vulnerable and that they could win a majority with an early election call. But to quote from Dynasties and Interludes, Pearson's weaknesses as a campaigner were now well known, and the absence of any clear issue on which to base an election call increased the possibility that an early election strategy might backfire. That sounds familiar. Nevertheless, the Liberals decided to go to the polls early. Pearson would lead his party for the fourth time, while Diefenbaker would mount his fifth campaign as PC leader. The New Democrats at this time were still led by Tommy Douglas, while Social Credit, which had won the third most seats in 1963, had split into a Western rump led by Robert Thompson and a Quebec wing led by Réal Cahouette. The Liberals campaigned on the need for a majority government, but Pearson didn't venture out of Ottawa much. He was running on his record in office and pitched some new programs like universal health insurance. Diefenbaker was a better campaigner than Pearson and went after the scandals within the Liberal government. In the end, the Liberals did not get the majority they were hoping for. In fact, the results were nearly identical to 1963. The Liberals won 131 seats, a gain of 3 seats, and they took 40% of the vote. They dropped just 1 point in the popular vote. The Progressive Conservatives won 97 seats, a gain of 4, and their popular vote was unchanged at 32%. The NDP jumped 4 seats to 21, and their popular vote went up 5 points to 18%, while the combination of the Ralliement des Créditistes and the Social Credit took 14 seats, that was down 10, and their popular vote dropped by 4 points to 8%. That was maybe the bigger shift. But the Liberals only gained 3 seats, the PCs only gained 4 seats. There really wasn't a lot of movement. It was a parliament that looked a lot like the one that was elected in 1963. The Liberals were able to hold on with very strong results in Quebec and a majority of seats in Ontario, but they suffered losses in Nova Scotia and Western Canada that were only made up by their gains in Quebec. The PCs nearly swept Western Canada and parts of the Maritimes, but managed only 33 seats in Ontario and Quebec, a third of what the Liberals had. The result meant the end for both Pearson and Diefenbaker, though both would stay on for a few more years. Diefenbaker didn't go quietly, running in the leadership race that was meant to replace him, but Robert Stanfield would take over the PCs in 1967. Tommy Douglas would lead the NDP into one more election, while Cahouette would solidify his hold on Social Credit. With the support from the NDP, Pearson's government brought in Medicare and continued the work on the Royal Commission on Bilingualism and Biculturalism. But by 1967, it was obvious a change was needed to take the party forward, and the following year, Pierre Trudeau became Liberal leader and Prime Minister. He'd lead the Liberals into a sweeping victory in the 1968 federal election. That'll be it for the podcast this week. There'll be plenty more to come as I parse through the results from this election and turn my focus on the upcoming provincial elections and whatever federal leadership races might get kicked off in the next few weeks or months. So check out the Writ.ca for more analysis, and if you haven't already, please consider buying a subscription to get access to all the content on the site. It's really appreciated. All right, have a good weekend, the first post-election weekend, and thanks for listening.